Financial statement and ratio analysis. So the purpose of financial statement and ratio analysis is to make comparisons. We need to make comparisons between companies, and we need to make comparisons for the same company for different time periods. Now, if I just looked at the unadjusted financial statements, I would have a big problem because oftentimes different companies are different sizes, and then even over the same company over different time frames will be different size. For example, what's happened to Apple over the last 20 years? Oh, come on. This isn't hard. Occasionally I throw you a softball just to give you a chance to feel good for answering a question correctly, right? Yeah, they keep getting bigger and bigger, right? So would it make any sense for me to say, well, Apple's net income's higher than it was in 1996, so they must be doing great? No, it wouldn't make any sense at all. I need to adjust for the change in size at Apple for me to know whether that net income is keeping up with the growth in the assets or the growth in the sales, or if they have not been keeping up. So let me see if I've got my... Okay, so company I worked at called American, family owned. Here's what we did. We took pigments and we put them into plastics. And so if you have anything that's plastic that has a color in it, is this plastic? Yeah. So the plastic pellets that went into this thing are actually clear or opaque, kind of milky looking. In order to get it to be green, what you got to do is put pigment in there. But you can't just throw pigment in with those plastic pellets because the color isn't dispersed. That thing would have weird streaks and it would look awful. So what did my company do? Well, we dispersed the pigment into a little bit of plastic up front, and then they would throw our color concentrate pellets in with that clear plastic to get this color hair. I'm not kidding, it's an entire industry to do that. Okay, now we were a family-owned company, and there was a company just across town, by the way, it's all happening up in Ohio, just across town called PauleyOne. And PauleyOne was a publicly traded firm. We were private, they were publicly traded. And as a result, we had access to their financial statements because remember, the SEC requires you to report your financial statements quarterly if you're publicly held, but they didn't have access to ours. And so that gave us an advantage that we could compare our firm to them, but they couldn't do likewise. Does that make sense? One time I actually managed to get my hands on the financial statements of the firm, and I had to, for an MBA school project, and I had to get my professor to sign a non-disclosure agreement because he saw the numbers of the firm. Can you imagine that? He was a nice guy and he signed. Anyway, back to the story. Let's talk about American. We were buying our plastic in, we were running in, say, hundreds or thousands of pounds. And PauleyOne was running in thousands to millions of pounds of product. And so would it make sense for us to say, oh, wait a minute, our net income is lower than PauleyOne, so therefore we must be a failure? No. Would it be good for us to say, hey, our inventory is lower than PauleyOne, we must be doing a great job at managing our inventory? No, of course it's going to be smaller because we're so much smaller, right? And so we need to be able to look at these things and come up with some way to put this on an apples to apples basis. And so what we're going to do is we are either going to do this common size financial statement thing that we're getting ready to talk about, or we're going to do financial ratio analysis. And so let's start by talking about common size financial statements. So what we're going to do is we're going to find one number on each of the financial statements to divide everything else by in order to kind of put things on an even basis. And for the balance sheet, it's very easy. We just use total assets, and then everything on the balance sheet then becomes a percentage of the total assets. So I would look at my inventory divide by the total assets, and I would say, hey, wait a minute, my inventory is much higher as a percentage of my total assets than PauleyOne. Maybe we're doing something wrong. Does that make sense? Let's talk about some of the other things on the balance sheet. What about accounts receivable? What if my accounts receivable as a percentage of assets was extraordinarily high? Maybe I'm being too generous with my credit terms. Accounts payable. What if my accounts payable is extraordinarily low compared to my competitor after I've done this division? Well, that might mean that I am not getting favorable payment terms from my suppliers, or crazily enough, sometimes people just pay their bills too soon. By the way, if they give you 30 days to pay, when should you pay? Day 30, I would go with day 29, just to make sure that the mail gets there and whatnot. You can't trust USPS anymore. Okay, so the point is, it's a free loan, right? It's interest free. So you want to wait as long as you possibly can to pay that back. Now, should you wait past the 30 days? I view that as being unethical, but some people make it a practice. And we'll talk more about that here in a bit. Okay, so you can do that with basically all the accounts on the balance sheet, and you can get an idea of how you perform versus your competitors. And then on the income statement, we're going to divide all the accounts by, and it says total sales here. But here's what you need to know. There are so many different things at the top of that net income statement. It may be operating revenue. It may, it'll come up with lots and lots of different words depending on the business that you're in. In fact, in retail, it won't be total sales, it'll be net sales. Why would we use net sales in retail instead of total sales?
Because like returns and stuff?
Yeah, returns and stuff. Very good. So my wife, she likes to buy clothes, but she doesn't like to go to the store. And so she buys these prime and free return things from Amazon. If she spots a dress that she likes, does she know, because it's on Amazon, does she know whether or not it's going to fit? No. So what does she do? She buys the size she thinks she'll be. She buys one size bigger. She buys one size smaller. In the end, she may end up sending all 3 dresses back. At best case, how many dresses is she going to keep? 1, returning 2 of them. That's why in retail it makes no sense whatsoever to use total sales instead we use net sales. So whatever it is on that top line is what we're going to divide everything on the income statement by. So let's start down from the top. Net income divided by sales. We have another name for that. It's called the profit margin, right? And if my profit margin were substantially lower than my competitor, that might mean something. And so then I start looking for where is the problem. And as we work our way down underneath that top line, we're going to have cost of goods sold. Cost of goods sold as a proportion of sales. If mine are significantly higher than my competitor, maybe I'm paying too much. Now, in the American and PauleyOne example, though, there's a problem here. Because we were running such small volumes that we were buying our plastic pellets in 55-pound bags, 25 kilograms. Our competitor was buying their plastic pellets by the rail car. Who do you think had a lower cost per pound? Yeah, the other guy, right? They didn't even have to bag that stuff up. And we're having to they're bagging it up, putting it on pallets and sending it to us on a truck instead of a train. That's less efficient. So there's all sorts of reasons why we had higher cost per pound, right? And so as a result, our cost of goods sold, common size income statement wise, was always going to be bigger than theirs. So we shouldn't freak out about that. But one thing we should freak out about is the next thing on the income statement, which is SG&A, selling, general, and administrative expenses. This is all the expense that goes into the firm that is not part of the cost of the goods sold. So the CEO's salary, the rent on the corporate headquarters, the secretary's salary, the accountant's salary, all those sorts of things go into SG&A. And so if our percentage of sales of SG&A was much higher than our competitors, we might have a problem. And in fact, what I've seen over the years is when you work at a firm, let's assume that you are just currently in a bad situation. you will cut SG&A expenses as much as you can. You'll get what we call lean, right? Call it a belt tightening exercise. And they take away things like the free coffee and the break room, and they do things like that to send signals. It doesn't save a lot of money, but it does send signals that we're getting rid of our unnecessary expenses. What do you think that we do with any extra personnel that might not be doing the best job? Yeah, you fire them and get that down. I always had a list in the back of my head. At peak, I had over 50 people working for me. I always had a list of people in the back of my head that if hard times hit, I was going to send them packing. Does that sound cruel? If you're going to be a good manager, this is the way you're going to have to think. Okay, so what happens during bad times? That gets down lean. It gets down to where it probably should be. But then when good times hit, what happens? You get excited and you're like, woohoo! And you say, we've got a lot of money. No, brother, you don't have a lot of money. The shareholders have a lot of money. But here's the problem. Remember the agency problem? Separation of ownership and control? The shareholders aren't there to say, hey, wait a minute, pal, you were doing just fine without the free coffee. In fact, the last place that I worked, they ended up getting one of those Keurig machines. And this is like 2001, when that was like majorly expensive. The little pods were like $3 a piece. It was just crazy. Why? Yeah, the money was flowing like wine, right? And when you see that, you see people upgrading their hotels. You see people hiring secretaries they really don't need. You see how this works? And then when the next downturn comes, because it always does, what do we have to go through again? Fire. Yeah, you got to fire people and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's why it's important to watch your percentage of SG&A from your common size income statement compared to your competitors. If it's going up at your own firm over time, or if you're extraordinarily high versus your competitors, you might need to start looking around. Does that make sense? Okay. So you can keep going on down all of these common size statements and take a look at each of the accounts and make comparisons and come to some conclusions. Now, why do we need to move on to financial ratios? Well, it turns out that not everything appears on only one statement. So, for instance, the purpose of inventory is to support sales. Did you guys know that? The reason we keep inventory is so we can sell stuff. We hate inventory. We would like to not have any inventory at all. But the reason that we've got it is because we want to make sales. Where do I find it? Which statement do I have inventory on? That's Hofstetter. Yeah, the balance sheet. She knows the answer. She's just shy. Okay, now, what statement do we see sales on? Ms. Gass, which statement do we see sales on? Oh, the income statement. She had a 50-50 shot. Oh no! So sadly, accounting is the language of business. And so no matter what you're going to do, you need to learn your accounting. It's kind of like English. I had some guys burying some cable near my house, and I went out to talk to them. They didn't speak English. Man, my Spanish is muy crapo. And so their supervisor came over to talk to me. She's from Moldova. We had some communication issues, right? Because we're not all speaking the same language. And that's why accounting is important in business. We all need to be able to speak the same language. And by the way, I recall you're a marketing person, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
What does this put her on the path to be? CEO. Do you think she's going to need to be able to read a balance sheet? Do you think she's going to need to be able to read an income statement? Yeah, absolutely. Work on it. Okay, back to the story. My point here is this stuff shows up on different statements. Common size financial statements will never allow us to be able to look at, for instance, how well we're handling our inventory. Okay. Now, what can we use these financial ratios for? Well, we can use them for competitive analysis, which we're already doing. We can use them for internal analysis. In other words, as our own performance dashboard, or they can be used by external analysts. So you'll have equity analysts, people that do the buy, sell, hold kind of rating on stocks. Your suppliers will care about these financial ratios. Why would your suppliers care? Why do they care about your financial condition at all? Yeah, they want to know if you can pay, right? Banks, same thing. Bondholders, the same thing. So all these people are going to be looking at that. Let's get back to internal analysis here. Internal analysis, in fact, most places you go, they'll have what they call their scoreboard or their dashboard. And the reason it's important to keep such a thing is otherwise, here's what you're doing. You're driving around in a car with no gauges, and your windows are painted black. Does that give you confidence in your ability to make it to St. Louis? No, right? And so in business, we have to be watching these things, and I guarantee you, if you don't watch these things, they will get out of control. In fact, here is truth. What gets measured gets managed. What do I mean by that? Have I told you before that I was overweight at one point? Yeah. So I was overweight, and when you're gaining weight, are you more or less likely to weigh yourself every morning? Less, because you just don't want to see what the bad news is today, right? But what did that do? It freed me up to, gain more weight. And at that point, the only way I was measuring my progress was by the fact that I had to keep buying new pants. Does that make sense? Okay, and so now I'm very careful, and I weigh myself every day, and I've got one of those like doctor office kind of scales with the sliding weights. I'm just like really on top of it. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, she'll go on a diet. She'll say, well, I don't want to weigh myself more than once a week or I might get discouraged. Who do you think is more successful at controlling their weight?
The one weighing themselves?
Yeah, I weigh myself every day. And if I see that I'm up, like today, I was down a half a pound. I may have little chocolate donuts this afternoon, if they've got them in the vending machine. Celebration, baby. But if my weight was up this morning, if I woke up and I was 3 pounds up, do you think I might behave differently as a result? Yeah. Okay, and it's the same way at businesses. If we are not measuring something and holding people accountable for those things, then they don't get managed. So let's start talking about these families of financial ratios. And we're going to see that these things are called families of ratios, and just like your family, the things within the family are similar, but they are not identical. My sister and I share some DNA, but we are not identical twins, right? So if you didn't get from the fact that she's female and I'm male, we are not identical twins. So what we're talking about here are things that are similar but not identical. And we're going to be starting with short-term solvency. In accounting and finance, when I say short-term, what do I mean? Yeah, less than a year. And another word for solvency is liquidity. Liquidity is basically your ability to pay your bills. So if you're insolvent or illiquid, you can't pay your bills. If you're liquid, you can pay your bills. And so the more liquid you are, the more likely it is you can pay your bills. Now let's discuss from a personal standpoint. Right now I've got a bunch of money that I put into my tax-deferred savings. I can't touch that till I'm 59 and a half years old, which is like 9 years away. How liquid are those assets to me? I can't get to them without a huge penalty, right? Now, I also have my own little fun stock account off to the side that I use for purposes primarily of gambling. how liquid are those assets? They're more liquid because I can actually go in there and buy and sell, but every time that I do, I'm going to have taxes, and I don't know if you've ever done it before, but figuring out your taxes on stock you bought 14 years ago, oh, it sucks. Okay, so that makes me reluctant to touch those. Not as badly. So they are slightly more liquid, but they're still, to me, illiquid. Then I've got money in a savings account. And that savings account, it takes 3 to 7 days for the money to be transferred from there to my checking account. So it's more liquid than my fund stock account, but it's still not as liquid as my checking account, which I can go right away and pull that money out and be able to pay things. And in fact, the most liquid thing of all is cash, right? Okay, so the more money I had in my checking account or savings account, the more likely it is I'll be able to pay my bills. And so that's why we call it liquidity. The more liquid you are, the more liquid your assets are, the more likely you are to be able to pay your bills. Now let's start with the first one. It's called the current ratio. And that's current assets divided by current liabilities. Remember, current assets are things that we expect to provide cash within the next year. Current liabilities are things we expect to consume cash within the next year. Which do I want to be larger, current assets or current liabilities? Yeah, we want the current assets to be larger because that means that we've got a chance then of paying off our bills over the coming year. If this thing, and therefore what we're looking for here is something greater than 1. Something greater than 1. If we have something less than 1 here, we're going to have a problem, and we need to start making some adjustments. Now, it turns out that not all current assets are created equally. They are different amounts of liquidity. So, for instance, cash is the most liquid, and then we would have inventory. Then we would have accounts receivable. Then we would have inventory. So inventory is the current asset that's most likely not to get sold in the next year. I'll give you an example. The company I used to work for, Halliburton, we had the T10 pump. It had ceased production in 1957. 1957. The year that I go to work at Halliburton was 1994. And the only people left in the world that were using the T10 pump was in communist Vietnam. And at that point, we did not have trade relations with communist Vietnam. What were the chances that we were going to be able to sell the T10 spare parts off of our shelves, which by the way had been there since the 60s? What are the chances that we're going to be able to sell those before the end of the year? 0, unless Bill Clinton came through for us and got us a trade deal, which he eventually did. But my point to you is this. There is inventory on the shelf that is not going to turn before the end of the year. And so that's why we come up with the quick ratio, also known as the acid test. The acid test. By the way, we give things more than one name. Why? I don't know. So what do to get to our quick ratio? We take current assets and we subtract out the inventory. Remember, inventory is part of current assets. So we are subtracting that part out because it might not sell, and then dividing by current liabilities. And what is the interpretation of that? If this thing is greater than 1, what it means is we will be able to pay our bills for the rest of the year without selling another single piece of inventory. If this thing is greater than 1, it means that we will be able to pay our bills over the coming year without selling another single piece of inventory. By the way, at a healthy company, are you going to sell inventory? Yeah. Okay. Now, most common calculation mistake, and I guarantee you at least 4 of you are going to make this mistake. And that is when we do this, so people say, well, wait a minute, current assets are cash plus accounts receivable plus inventory minus inventory. And so they'll say, well, wait a minute, it's just cash plus accounts receivable minus inventory. That's wrong. Keep in mind, it's cash plus accounts receivable plus inventory minus inventory. What happens to the inventories? Yeah, they cancel out. And so it's just cash plus accounts receivable. And I guarantee you at least one of you will email me and say, I looked at the solution and they don't even pay any attention to inventory at all. What's up with that? Well, they just didn't write out the plus inventory minus inventory and then scratch them out. That's what's going on there. Okay, now let's assume that that's not even conservative enough for you. Then we can look at the cash ratio. And the cash ratio is just cash divided by current liabilities. And so that means the other current asset that we've been talking about, accounts receivable, it doesn't come into play for figuring the cash ratio. So here's the interpretation. If cash ratio is greater than 1, that means I will be able to pay all of my bills over the coming year without selling another single piece of inventory and without collecting another single dollar from my deadbeat customers. Does that make sense? If this thing is greater than 1, it means I can pay my bills for the rest of the year without having to sell another single piece of inventory or collect another a dollar from my customers. Yes?
Is it common to be over 1?
Oh, very good. This is where we're headed next. In fact, it would be a bad sign if a company had a cash ratio greater than 1. Here's why. At healthy companies, do they turn inventory? Oh yeah. At healthy companies, do the customers, most of them, pay their bills? Yeah. And so if you're sitting there with a cash ratio greater than 1, what it means is you've got a bunch of cash that is not earning a good return for your shareholders. By the way, do my shareholders, are they paying me to sit on a pile of cash? No. They could do that themselves, right? And they could do it without paying me. And so what they are paying me to go out and do is find these good investment projects and invest in those and create shareholder wealth. They are not asking me to keep their checkbook for them. Does that make sense? And so if we are holding too much cash, it means we are missing out. Now let's talk about what kinds of companies hold too much cash. I'll give you 2 examples. Number 1 is Apple, and number 2 is Microsoft. And both of these, it was more true a while back. And here's why. If a company is started by an entrepreneur, and that guy or gal is still in charge 20 years later when that company is successful, that company tends to hold too much cash. And here's why. Because that entrepreneur in the beginning, they had to go out and raise cash. And when they went to the local bank, what do you think they were told? Beat it, hippie, right? That's Steve Jobs. Beat it, hippie. We don't do business with people with hair like yours, right? Get out of here. Those little glasses freak me out. Get out of here. Now, he eventually, of course, things get good, but do you think he always in the back of his mind had that there's always a chance that someone's not gonna want to loan me money or not want to buy the stock, so I always have to keep cash on hand. Does that make sense? Now, when you replace him with a professional manager who had never had that experience, what you'll typically see is that the cash ratio will go down because they stop holding as much cash because that person does not have that same memory. And it comes down to a personal thing too. I grew up, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad had an hourly job at the dynamite plant. I'll tell you more about the dynamite plant later. But what did that mean? It means if he lost his job, we were out of luck, right? And the only way that you make it in that case is to have a cushion of cash. Now, by the way, I work for a state university. I'm a tenured professor. What are my chances of losing my job tomorrow? I'd have to do something really terrible, like sacrifice a goat in front of the class, something like that. It's not going to happen, but I still have that memory, and I probably still hold too much cash. Now, don't come to my house looking for it because it's not there, right? But I probably carry too much cash just because I always have that in the back of my head. I don't want to eat mustard sandwiches again. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, who's going to care about these measures? Well, first of all, suppliers. Why would suppliers care about your ability to pay bills within the next year? Yeah, they're loaning you money on a 30, 60, 90-day basis. If you are good for the next year, you should be able to pay your bills to them. Does that make sense? And then other short-term creditors, banks that are going to loan you money to go out and buy some inventory. Anyone basically that's loaning you money on less than 1 year basis is definitely going to be interested in these short-term solvency or liquidity measures. Any questions? Long-term solvency measures. What do we mean by long-term in accounting and finance? Yeah, greater than a year. And basically, we're going to see that this family breaks down into two subfamilies. We're going to have some that are called the leverage measures, and then we're going to have some interest coverage measures. And so you can think of these as cousins. So think of all the things within the leverage measures as brothers and sisters, and underneath interest coverage measures, they would be brothers and sisters, but between those two groups, say that they're cousins, because they're all looking at your ability to pay your bills more than 1 year into the future. By the way, if you are a long-term creditor, and we're going to talk about that's who cares about these things, do you only care about the long-term solvency measures? Or do you also care about the short-term?
You should care about the short term.
Yeah, you should care about the short-term. Any idea why?
If they fail in the short term, you're not going to get paid in the long term.
Very good. If I die today, there is no long term. Does that make sense? And so these long-term creditors, they're going to be focused on these long-term measures, but they're also going to be keeping an eye on those short-term solvency measures. Okay, so if I recall correctly, we had just finished talking about short-term solvency liquidity, but I made a mistake. I did not tell you what to do if these measures are bad. So I gave you the diagnosis, but I didn't give you the treatment. So here's the treatment. Let's assume your current ratio is less than 1. Would it help to go out and borrow more money short term and put it in the checking account? Would that help your current ratio? Are you on with yes? Oh, swing and a miss. Okay, so here's the problem. If you go out and borrow money in the short term, what does that do to your current liabilities? They go up. Your current assets go up by the same amount. Are you really making any headway there? No. So what do we need to do? We need to do one of two things. We either need to go out and borrow on the long term and put that money in the checking account, or we need to issue additional stock and put that money in the checking account. And you see people do both things. Or maybe you could sell off some long-term assets you're not using and put that money in the checking account. All of those things will help your short-term solvency, but borrowing on the short term will not do that. Questions? Okay. And we said that we've got these two subfamilies of long-term solvency measures. And the first one, family, is called leverage. Leverage has to do with the amount of debt in the capital structure. Leverage has to do with the amount of debt in the capital structure. And the higher that amount of debt, the greater the leverage. Now let's talk about why it's called leverage. This is my crudely drawn picture of a lever. From here to here is 1 meter, and from here to here is 3 meters. If I push down here with 100 pounds of force, how much force comes up on this end? Anyone remember their basic science? Oh, you're kidding. We've raised an entire generation of people who don't know how to use a stick to move something. This is sad. Okay, so 100 times 3 is 300 pound meters, and so it would be 300 pounds of force up. That's how levers work. Now, what does this have to do with debt? Imagine if we are wanting to buy, or if we have $100 million in equity. If I only use equity to make my investments, I can only buy $100 million worth of assets. But what if I also use $200 million worth of debt? Now for that $100 million in assets, or in equity, I can buy $300 million in assets. That's what leverage is all about. You can buy more stuff with the same level of wealth, just like you can lift more stuff with the same amount of force. Now you may, if any of you work with British people, you may end up hearing this called gearing. And the idea is very similar. If any of you are, these are my crappy pictures of gears. If any of you are bicyclists, you may recognize about little gears and big gears and how they work together, that sort of stuff. So, same concept, so you may hear it called gearing. Either way, it's all about how much debt is in the capital structure. Okay, let's talk about the first one, the total debt ratio. And the first formula that you see says total assets minus total equity divided by total assets, which, by the way, is just total debt over total assets. You say, why in the world would we go to the trouble of substituting total assets minus total equity in for total debt? And the answer is this. If we don't do it that way, and I just tell students total debt, they tend to grab only the long-term debt and not the total debt. And so what we're looking at here is total debt. The way you can make sure you get that is total assets minus total equity. Okay, then we have, and by the way, this is just what percentage of the capital structure is debt. It's actually my favorite. And the next one is my least favorite, and here's why. Let's take a look at it. It's called the debt to equity ratio, and it's total debt divided by total equity. Once again, you can substitute total assets minus total equity to get that, and it's just total debt over total equity. Here's why I don't like it. Think about this. If you've got, right now, half debt and half equity, then you have a debt to equity debt to equity ratio of 1. But what if I raise it to 60% debt and lower it to 40% equity? Now it's 1.5. And so for just a 10% change up on the debt and down on the equity, my measurement went up by 1.5. We call this a non-linear response to the change in the amount of debt in the capital structure. That's why I don't like this. You say, why in the world then are you teaching it to us? And the answer is, apparently everyone on the planet, other than me, is enamored with it. Because you'll hear these people on CNBC talking about the debt to equity ratio. You'll hear equity analysts talking about it. So you need to know about it. And I'll even show you how to use it in calculations. But once again, it's not my favorite. And then finally we have the equity multiplier, which is just total assets over total equity. And strangely enough, you can find it by doing 1 plus total debt divided by total equity. And let me show you why that is. Total assets is equal to total debt, let's say total equity, plus total debt. So can we agree on that? Any errors so far? Okay, so this, if I divide everything here by TE, I get the equity multiplier over here. And what happens to this? Yeah, it just becomes 1, right? And so that's why the equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. Now, when will this come in handy? When you're doing a calculation and you say, I need the equity multiplier, but all that bastard gave me is the debt to equity ratio. When you think that, I want you to think, all I have to do is add 1, right? I'll say that one more time. I won't use the naughty word. When you're on an exam and you say, wait a minute, I need the equity multiplier, but all he's given me is a debt to equity ratio. What do I do? Aha, 1 plus the debt to equity ratio gives me the equity multiplier. Questions? Okay. And we're going to see equity multiplier and why we call it the equity multiplier, but it's very closely related to this whole gearing thing, which is why it's called one of the leverage measures. Then we have the interest coverage measures. And the first one is times interest earned, or TIE. You may also hear it called TIE. And it is EBIT divided by interest. What does this mean? This is the basic question here is, do we have enough money to pay our interest? In fact, both of these coverage measures are, do we have enough money to pay our interest? Now, when you pay back a loan, you're actually paying back two things. What are they? Interest and principal. Very good. Now, the way that your car loan works, the way that my mortgage works, is that each payment consists of both principal and interest. But here's what you need to know about most corporate debt. It's interest only right up until the very end, and then all that principal comes due. Do you think that companies usually just have a pile of money laying around that they then can pay off that principal with? No, what do? I told you last time, I think, or a time or two ago, they go out and borrow more money, right? They use new money to pay off old. And so as a result, as someone who's loaning money to a company, all I'm really concerned about is their ability to cover the interest. Now, we have seen financial crises before, for instance, 2008, 2009, where companies were unable to refinance their debt. So occasionally we have these frozen credit markets that would make you extraordinarily cautious about this sort of thing. But most times, including now, all we really care about is making sure these people can pay their interest. So let's talk about why it is EBIT divided by interest. What does EBIT stand for? Earnings before interest and taxes. Very good. Most people say income taxes. That's not right. So it's earnings before interest and taxes. Now, we understand why they're saying earnings before interest, but why is it okay for us to disregard taxes here? The answer comes down to this. Interest is tax deductible. And so, let's say that I had $100 in EBIT, and I end up having to pay $100 in interest. What are my taxes going to be? They're testing the emergency system. It's just a test. If I have $100 in earnings before interest and taxes, and now I pay $100 in interest, how much are my earnings before taxes? This is not hard, people. Yeah, zero. If you don't make any money, your taxes are zero. And so as a result, we're not really concerned about the taxes here. And the interpretation would be, as long as times interest earned is greater than 1, the firm should be able to cover its interest expenses over the coming year. Because we're going to do this on a yearly basis. Of course, you could actually do it any period. You could do it for quarters if you wanted. Now, there's one downfall to that times interest earned measure, and that is that EBIT has depreciation subtracted out. Is depreciation a real cash flow? No. And so if we're looking for cash that we can use to pay our interest with, we really need to add that depreciation back. And so that's why we come up with the cash coverage ratio. The cash coverage ratio says, let's take that EBIT, add back depreciation, divide by interest, and if that thing is greater than 1, then we will be able to pay all of our interest within the coming period. Now, which one of these is more conservative? For firms with depreciation, with any depreciation at all, it's going to be the TIE. So here's what I would do. Figure the TIE first, If it's greater than 1, you're in the safe zone. Of course, you'd rather be higher, right? But if not, then go ahead and figure your cash coverage ratio and see if they're going to be able to, firms may have huge capital investments that have led to a lot of depreciation, so they may have a lot more cash than you might think. You gotta add that depreciation back. Any questions so far? Okay, now we can talk about how to lower a total. By the way, if I'm going to loan money to these people, do I want them to have a higher total debt ratio or a lower total debt ratio? Yeah, lower. And if you can't remember that, just ask yourself, who would I rather loan money to? A guy that owes a bunch of money or someone who owes no money whatsoever? You'd always rather loan it to someone who owes no money whatsoever because all of their repayment money can be directed at you. Whereas if they've got a bunch of other debt, they have to split it up among a bunch of people and there may not be enough, right? Okay, so if I'm loaning money to you, I would rather you have a lower total debt ratio. How would I go about doing that? Well, I could issue some equity and use that equity to pay down some debt. My total assets would stay the same, but my total debt would go down. Does that make sense? Now, of course, issuing shares is something we don't want to do lightly, but if you find yourself in this situation, it may make sense to do so. And then what about the interest coverage measures? Well, it would be great if we could just instantaneously make ourselves more profitable. Can we do that? If you could, don't you think people would, right? And so really the only thing we can control there is making that interest smaller. What can you do? Well, you might issue some equity to pay off some debt to reduce your interest. You might also refinance debt. My mortgage, when I first came to Springfield, it was like 8%, and it's because we came to town, we've been wiped out on a house down in Mississippi. We had no money. And strangely enough, in the middle of the housing bust, they offered us to fund 100% of the house through debt. Now, is that a risky proposition? Yeah. What do you think that did to the interest rate on the mortgage? Yeah, it was high for the time. It was 8%. And my mortgage guy said, he groused about it, and I said, hey, don't worry about it. I'll just wait for the next financial crisis and refinance. And sure enough, I did. In fact, I've refinanced 2 or 3 times. I'm down to 3.375. Now, we recently had another crisis. I could have gone a little bit lower, but at some point, transactions costs and just the sheer pain in the butt of refinancing a house doesn't make it worth it, right? I can live with 3.375%. Companies can do the same thing. If you can go out and buy or sell new bonds that have a lower interest rate on them than your existing bonds, go out and do that. And if you can buy back those existing bonds, go ahead and make it happen. Okay, so who cares about this stuff? Long-term creditors, banks loaning you money for more than 1 year, and definitely potential bond holders, people who are going to buy the firm's bonds. Are there any questions? Okay. Now let's talk about asset management or turnover measures. And the first one we're going to talk about is inventory turnover. Inventory turnover in your strategy class, they may tell you it's sales divided by inventory. That is absolutely wrong. It is, by the way, what does COGS stand for? Cost of goods sold. It's cost of goods sold divided by inventory. And here's the reason we want to do this. Basically, we're looking at how many times a year do we sell our inventory. And the reason that we're using cost of goods sold is because it is recorded at cost. And inventory is recorded at cost. This gives us an apples to apples comparison. If I put sales on the top there, that's not recorded at cost, that's recorded at what we're selling it to the customer. Does that make sense? And so it would be inflated. So when your strategy professor, which might or might not be my wife, tells you it's sales over inventory, tell her, no, it's not. She knows. We've had this conversation. Okay, now, would you rather your inventory turns be higher or lower? Yeah, we want them to be higher. And here's the way to think about that. Do firms really want to carry inventory? No. Inventory is money that I'm investing in stuff that's going to sit on the shelf and not do anything until I sell it. The only reason I carry inventory is so I can make sales. Does that make sense? Okay. So if I could get by with no inventory whatsoever, I would. For example, having your app on the App Store, what are the inventory turns? It's infinite, right? You got no inventory and you're bringing in money, it's all good. Okay, now, what are the two ways that you can improve your inventory turns? Well, sometimes students say, increase cost of goods sold. Now, what are they really saying? They're saying, sell more stuff using the same inventory. Because you sure don't want to just negotiate higher prices with your suppliers, because that's dumb, right? And so what they're saying is we want to increase sales in a very short-term kind of way. Anybody in here ever done sales? So I'm going to say something here, and I want you to, and it may be different than what you've experienced, but I think maybe you've had this experience. So hunting. When you go out and hunt, you go out, you find the animal, and you shoot it, right? Gardening, what do? You go out. You plow the soil, you fertilize the soil, you plant the seeds, you water the seeds, and you pull the weeds, and you keep after it, you keep after it, you keep after it. You might or might not get a crop. Which one of those is more like sales?
Gardening.
It's gardening, right? So I used to be a sales guy, and I have to go out and visit with them. You have to gain their trust. You have to learn what the problems are that you're going to try to solve for them. And then you have to come back with a solution. You have to prove to them that it's going to work. You have to prove to them that you're going to be there for the long haul with them. And so this is a trust building exercise. It's also proving that you know what you're doing, right? And so it was so funny. My sister got her first sales job after I was already doing this thing. And my mom, we were all there for Thanksgiving, and my sister had just made her first round of visits to her customers. And Mom says, "Did you sell anything?" And my sister and I both just busted out laughing. I said, "Mom, this isn't hunting, it's gardening." Okay, so back to the question. Can you immediately pop your sales up? No. So what do you have to do? You have to lower the inventory. So how do we go about lowering our inventory? Well, we look at what is making our inventory too big. And there are two kinds of things in our inventory. There are things that we've bought, and there are things that we've made. If it's stuff that we've bought, it's relatively easy. We just stop ordering the stuff until the inventory comes down to where we want it. If it's stuff that we've made, it's a little harder. I always tried to run my guys on 50 hours a week, 48, 50 hours a week. And then if I needed to slow down production, I could do so without having to lay anybody off. But what if the situation is so dire that you're going to have to do something? For instance, the Chevy Bolt plant. I don't know if you guys know this. Chevy Bolt doesn't sell for anything. It's a terrible car. I shouldn't say that. It's a car that nobody wants to buy. And so they actually have to shut down the line for months at a time until the inventory comes down, and then they fire up the line again. I don't think they're going to be firing up the line again. When I first worked, first job out of college was at Halliburton. I was at a place called Duncan, Oklahoma, and we had inventory coming out of our ears. And they brought in these guys from GE, and when they saw how much inventory we had, they immediately threw up, because it was just way too much. I'm not kidding. The first day I'm there, the industrial engineer that I'm assigned to kind of tag along with, he takes me, he says, "You got to see this. It's great." And we go to this huge warehouse, and there's not a single light on in the whole thing. And he goes, "Bloop, bloop, bloop, bloop," and this kind of robot thing takes flying off down there, and goes, bloop, 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 comes back with a pallet of stuff. He says, "We have all sorts of crap back there." What's wrong with this picture? All that stuff required us to spend money to put it on the shelf, and it's killing our asset management measures that the investors are looking at. That's not a good investment of the shareholders' money, right? Okay, so what did we do? We did this little exercise I just talked about. We looked at make versus buy, and the make stuff, we just stopped ordering it. That's the easy part. The buy stuff, we looked at what we needed to stop making, which was almost everything. And this was the summer of 1994. It was in South Oklahoma. It's right on the Red River. Hotter than hell. So, but luckily it was an air conditioned factory. And so the first thing we did is we said, okay, we're going to shut down the plant for a week and clean. And we cleaned that place to within an inch of its life. And at the end of the week, we kind of took the temperature of the inventory, and it wasn't down far enough. And so then we said, okay, week 2, we're going to paint. And we made a very bad decision. We let everybody choose what color to paint their own machine. Because when we got done, it looked like some of those ratty little Gulf Coast towns with all the different colors. Yeah. Okay, so we did that. At the end of week 2, inventory still was not where we needed to be. And so then we went with the nuclear option. We sent everybody outside in the Oklahoma sun to cut weeds. And we had plenty of weeds because we had plenty of land. It's Oklahoma, land's cheap. We had plenty of land, we got our guys out there, and finally at the end of the week, we took the temperature of our inventory and it was at the level we needed it to be to have the turns that we wanted, and we brought everybody back in, and I had never seen anybody in my life so happy to walk into an air-conditioned factory and those guys coming in from cutting weeds. They were glad to be back on the job. Now, here's a question. Why didn't we just lay everybody off for 3 weeks?
People can't go without a job for 3 weeks, so they probably get another job.
Yeah, so your good employees, I've always got something in the back of my head that I'm going to do if they kick me loose here, right? Your good employees are going to go somewhere else. Who are you sure to get back at the end of the 3 weeks?
The ones that can't get other jobs.
Yeah, the lazy ones, the ones that can't get another job, the ones that just went home and slept for 3 weeks. Is that who you want back? No. So we had an investment in these people. We trained these people. These people knew our system. We're for sure not going to just kick them loose because we knew we would need them again at the end of the 3 weeks. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's how we're going to manage inventory. Now we can also look at inventory through something called days sales and inventory, and it's simply 365 divided by inventory turns. Where did the 365 come from? Yeah, it's the number of days in a year. Now, I will ask because, is today Chinese New Year or was it yesterday, Mr. Wong?
Yeah.
Today or yesterday?
It's today.
Today. You know more than Mr. Wong. Oh, so sad. Okay, I know, you're in 2 different time zones. I understand. Okay, so let's ask Mr. Wong. You have a different New Year in China. How many days in the year in China?
16.
It's the same, right? 365. If he were going to do this thing in China, he would do the same thing, 365. Okay, now, what does that mean? Let's assume that my days sales in receivable is 30 days. What does that mean? It means on average, it takes me 30 days to sell out my entire inventory. Does that mean everything sells out in 30 days? No. Some things will be selling out every 2 days, right? We'll be turning that inventory very frequently. Some things will be there for a long time. We would prefer for days sales and inventory to be lower, but it really depends on the business that you're in. For example, I used to work in a nuclear power plant, and every day the nuclear power plant was down, and by the way, these are 1991 numbers. Every day the plant was down cost $1 million. Do you think we were interested in having spare parts available? Oh, hell yeah. Because if we could cut the time the plant was down by 1 day, we've saved $1 million. So for example, while I was there, we had to order a part, and it came out of New York, and I don't know how long it had been sitting on the shelf, but we got the part, and they paid $40,000, keep in mind $1991, $40,000 to fly this thing to Russellville, Arkansas on a private jet. Do you think they ever paid for me to go on a private jet? Heck no. What was so important? We had $1 million a day depending on this thing showing up in a timely manner. Now, if you're a kind of company that supplies those parts, the need is immediate, so you have to have it on the shelf. Your inventory turns may look like crap. Does that make sense? And it's the same thing with airplane parts. Do you think airlines want to be able to get the plane back in the air as fast as possible? Yeah, and so they may have a jet engine or two just sitting around, and they may sit around for years until one day the call comes. You gotta grab the engine and run. Does that make sense? What do you think the turns look like at the grocery store? They've got to be very, very high, right? First of all, we have perishable stuff. Do you want perishables? Do you want your apples to sit on the shelf for 3 years? Oh my goodness, they would not be attractive, would they? But even the canned goods, those are turning fairly fast. And so it depends on the industry that we're looking at, what we should look for at day sales and inventory. The turns at grocery stores also have to be very high because the profit margin on each individual item is quite low. And so we have to sell that item many times during the year to make a meaningful profit. Okay, let's talk about receivables. Receivables are what we get when we sell something to someone on credit. And the way that we calculate our receivables turns is sales over accounts receivable. More specifically, and make a note of this, more specifically, it's total credit sales. Total credit sales. Because only the credit sales show up in accounts receivable. Okay, now unless I tell you otherwise, always assume all sales are on credit. Unless I tell you otherwise, always assume that all sales are on credit. And that's pretty much the case in American business, Chinese business, probably in Colombia. People do business on credit. And as long as you can trust your customers, you're going to do that, right? By the way, credit's kind of like inventory. Do we really want to have to extend credit? Are you just looking, are you thinking, wow, who could I loan money to today at a 0% interest rate? I don't wake up like that. Why do we do it?
To make the sale?
Yeah. Now, if nobody in the industry offered credit, would we need to?
No.
No. But as soon as we start offering credit in our industry, what does everybody have to do? Yeah, they have to offer credit or they're going to lose a sale, right? And so it's a prisoner's dilemma. If you don't know what that is, kind of Google it. But what it turns out to be is you have to offer it if everybody else does, or you're going to lose out. So what does that mean for us? It means we're going to have accounts receivable. We do, just like inventory, we don't want to carry a lot of accounts receivable. We only want to carry as much as we have to make the sales, right? Okay, so we are going to take sales and divide by accounts receivable. Now, notice this is similar to cost of goods sold over inventory, but in this case, let's call them retail prices. Sales is recorded at the price we sell at, and so is accounts receivable. And so we're doing the same thing here, making sure we've got an apples to apples comparison by using the price that we sell this stuff at. It's on both top and bottom. Okay, just like with inventory, we would prefer to have higher turns. In other words, we would prefer to be making more sales with the same accounts receivable, or the same amount of sales with less accounts receivable. When I get done here, we're going to talk about how to manage your accounts receivable. I think I've got a whole slide on that. Okay, now, what about days sales in receivables? Once again, we take 365, divide by the receivables turns. And what that gives us is the average number of days that it takes for our customers to pay their bills. That's the average number of days that it takes our customers to pay their bills. Now, how do we know if we're doing well or doing poorly on this? Let's say, for instance, we do the math and we see we've got 59 days of sales in receivables. Is that good or bad? Truth is, we don't know until we mention what our terms are. If we are telling our customers to pay in 60 days, 59 is perfectly fine. What if we're telling our customers to pay in 30 days? Does 59 look good then? No, our customers are taking advantage of us. So I did some pro bono consulting. What does pro bono mean? I'll ask our future lawyer. Free, yeah, she says I don't do that. Okay, so I was doing some pro bono consulting, and this is during the financial crisis, well, not the most recent one, the one before that, and I was looking at these people's charts, and their accounts receivable was going up, 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 and I said, let me guess, you think of your customers as friends? And they said, yeah. I said, your friends are taking advantage of you. They're treating you like a zero interest bank, and because you're their friend, you're not calling them out. You need to call them out. I said, I don't need more friends. I've got plenty of friends. What I need are paying customers, which I thought was really funny since I was doing this whole thing pro bono, that I told them I needed paying customers. Okay. Now let's talk about total asset turnover. Sales divided by total assets. And basically, it's how well are we utilizing, how efficiently are we utilizing our assets to produce sales. And as we discussed before, if we're going to try to make this thing better or higher, of course higher would be better, there are two things we could do. One, we could increase sales, which we said isn't possible in the short term. The other thing we can do is to reduce our total assets. So I'm going to give you an example here. Two different car companies. Hyundai, their plants run nearly 100% capacity. They are producing basically as much sales as they can with their assets. Stellantis. Do you guys know what Stellantis is? Oh my goodness, they keep changing the name of this darn thing. So Stellantis used to be FCA, which was Fiat Chrysler, which used to be Chrysler. Yeah, so it gets really confusing. But Stellantis, which to me sounds like some sort of drug you would take for a stomach problem. But Stellantis is now the maker of those products. And their factories, because apparently people don't like the Dodge Caravan, their factories run at a much lower percent of utilization. As a result, they are not producing nearly as much sales with the same assets, let's say. Now, how could they get around that? Can they immediately entice, by the way, any of you guys want to run out and buy a Dodge Caravan to help them out? No, hell no. Minivans are like sweatpants, right? Okay, back to the story. What can they do? Well, let's say that they've got 3 plants that are all operating at 40%. Maybe they shut down one plant and sell it, right? It reduces their total assets. They're not going to do anything in the short term to increase their sales, but they can sell off some extra assets. Does that make sense? Okay. So who cares about these things? Well, first of all, firm managers concerned about performance. Every month, my accountant, Jack Heffelfinger, I may have told you about him before, Jack would call me into his office and we would go over my numbers. And these were some of the numbers that we would talk about. Then we have equity analysts and competitors. So people who are doing that buy, sell, hold kind of thing, telling people whether to buy your stock or not, those are equity analysts. And our competitors. Why would our competitors care what we were doing? What kind of analysis are they doing? They're comparing their performance to ours, right? Does that make sense? Should you be comparing your performance to other people's? Absolutely. When I went to do this pro bono consulting, I won't tell you the industry, but I managed to find someone who was doing almost precisely the same thing that these people were doing. And, but they were publicly traded. So I could get their financial statements. And so I calculated a bunch of these ratios for these guys. These guys never trusted me enough to give me their financial statements. I can't say that I blame him, I look shifty. But I said, look, here's the formulas. You guys can figure this for yourself and then compare, and you can see where you're at. And then the accountant scurried off with all that stuff, and I never saw him again. Okay. Questions? I think now we need to talk about managing receivables. So, once again, receivables, we've shipped the goods to the people haven't yet paid us. And I'm going to tell you a true story. Remember, I told you I would tell you if it was bullshit. This is a true story. I met a man who had been a CFO. The company is now a Fortune 500 company, but when he was CFO, they were a much younger, struggling company. And he told me, in fact, this is a company around here within the four-state area. So he told me that this is how he handled paying the bills. He says the bill would come in. By the way, this is the age before computers, right? He has to type everything out. And he gets in the bill from the supplier. He was buying a lot of steel. And he would type up the check. And he would put it in an envelope, address it, and then he would put it in his desk drawer. When do you think he would mail the check? You say it?
The day it was due.
The day it was due. That's what I would tell you to do. But instead,
So when I called him,
yeah, who said that? Oh, that's a smart man. He waited until the supplier called, and the supplier says, "Oh, hey, you know that steel we sent you 75 days ago? Apparently your check got lost in the mail. Would you go ahead and send that to us?" He would say, "Oh yeah." He opens up his desk drawer, he pulls up the check, he says, "The check's in the mail." He would go and drop it in the outgoing mail. He said, "I did that for 5 years. And only one supplier ever figured it out. This guy, Robert, would call him on day 29. Hey, Frank, just a reminder, you need to send a check to us tomorrow. That work for you?" "Yeah, check's in the mail." One person figured it out in all that time. Now, what am I telling you? When you start dealing with situations like this, you're going to have people who don't pay their bills. And in fact, so I asked one time students, how can we fix this situation? And what they said was, give them more time to pay. If you were giving them 30 days and they were taking 59, what are they going to do now? You're going to give them 60 and they're going to take 89, or maybe they'll push their luck and try to double it out on you just like they were before. Does that make sense? This is how humans are. So I had this guy named Ramon. Ramon was on my second shift in Dallas, Texas, and Ramon shows up for work 3:15. I'm like, "Hey Ramon, your work time, start time is 3 o'clock. He says, "Yeah, I know." He says, "But my wife doesn't drive and I have to pick the kids up at school." Da, 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 da. I said, I'm 25 years old. I don't know anything. Wet behind the ears, trying to be the good boss, right? I said, "Ramon, I'm so sorry to hear that. I tell you what, why don't we make your start time 3:15, and instead of taking a full hour for lunch, you just take 45 minutes. He said, "Oh, thank you so much. That would be so helpful." Do you know what time Ramon showed up the next day?
3:30.
3:30. After that, I said, "No, Ramon, we're back at 3 o'clock. And if you can't make it on time, you won't be working here for long." And that's when the write-up started. And then eventually, Ramon, sensing I was going to fire him, actually quit. Now, what does that have to do with customers? If you give your customers more time to pay, they're not gonna stay like that. So it's like you and the speed limit, right? When I started driving in 1987, speed limit was 55 miles an hour. Then they raised it to, and you know how fast I drove? 65. Then they raised the speed limit to 65 miles an hour, and certainly the highway patrol said, "Oh, now Haggard will obey the speed limit." Now, how fast did I drive? 75. And then, now they've raised it to 75 down in Arkansas. Certainly. Haggard will not obey no. Right? This is how humans are. Especially when there's money involved. Okay, so what do? Call them. Just call them. Hey, notice we haven't gotten your check yet. Appreciate it if you could just go ahead and send that on over. You ever heard the expression, the squeaky wheel gets the grease? So you got a wagon. It's got 4 wheels on it. One of them is squeaking and you only have enough grease for 1 wheel. You're going to put the grease on the squeaky wheel. Be the squeaky wheel. Call them. Ask for the money. I had a buddy whose father ran a fuel distributorship. And he was a softie. And people would tell him sob stories about how their kids didn't have shoes. By the way, the man had 6 kids of his own who didn't have shoes. And so, who did he put in charge of collecting the bills? Any guesses? His wife. Best bill collector at the company, right? Why is she better than he is? She knows that she doesn't have enough money to put shoes on her kids or food on the table, right? She gets out there and she actually shakes the trees and the money falls out. By the way, people typically have the money. They're just not paying you. I have a friend that does work for an architect here in town. The architect, once he gets paid, then he turns around and pays the electrical engineer, my friend. And he was doing some work for the Springfield School District. And my friend kept asking about when's the money going to come in. And this guy would say, oh, the school district hasn't paid. And my friend says, hey, what about, you know what, I'm good friends with, and he names the board member, the school board member. He says, why don't I reach out to them and see what we can do about getting this payment shook loose? The guy says, you'll have your money tomorrow. The guy was lying to him, right? So he could sit on the money. Is that disgusting? That's unethical, for sure. Okay, questions? Let's talk about profitability measures. Profit margin is just net income divided by sales. You might think of it as the number of cents per dollar of sales that you make in profit. And if we wanted to improve that, 2 ways. One, we could increase net income, or we could make sales smaller. Does making sales smaller sound like something we want to do? No. Only if we're stopping selling money-losing items, right? What we want to do is make our net income larger. But we've already discussed that you can't go out and instantly stir up additional sales. So what can you do? You got to cut your costs. And what kind of costs are you going to get rid of? You want to get rid of stuff that we call non-value add. If it doesn't bring value to your customer, you'll want to get rid of it. For example, let's think of a company that makes spark plugs and they sell directly to the auto manufacturer. I don't know if you've ever changed, anybody here ever changed spark plugs on a car?
On a jet ski.
On a jet ski, okay. So the spark plug, when it comes packaged, it comes in a little bitty box. It's got a little cellophane on it, you can see it in there. And then all the spark plugs come in another box. Now, assume that you're building Corvettes. The Corvette has 8 spark plugs. Do you really want your people on the floor having to go through all that packaging? No. It's actually destroying value for the customer. And so in that case, what you could do is use some sort of reusable packaging that they could easily pick the parts out of and then send right back to you. And you could cut some costs and make life better for your customer at the same time. There are all sorts of things you can do to get rid of spending money on things that don't really bring any value. Now you got to be careful though, because there are things called premium packaging. So when you buy a new iPhone, anybody here have an iPhone? You buy the iPhone and you get that box. How does the box feel? Is there a certain way the box feels? Yeah. How does it compare to how other boxes you get electronics in feel? It's got a premium feel to it, right? And you lift it up and it goes, right? That's kind of a neat feeling, unless your phone drops out on the floor, right? So there is value in that sort of thing. I'm not telling you to get rid of that, but I am telling you to get rid of things that don't bring any value to the customer. I'm always seeing the stuff that says, ooh, it was handmade. Does that bring any value to me? No. Especially with food. I would rather my food be made by a machine. The worst I'm going to get from that would be a computer virus, right? Instead of getting whatever, like hepatitis from people that are going to the toilet, not washing their hands, and then making the food. Does that make sense? Okay, so we want to increase our net income by cutting non-value added costs. And then let's talk about EBITDA margin. Oh my goodness, it gets worse. So we know what EBIT stands for. What's DA?
The depreciation and amortization.
Oh, very good. Depreciation and amortization. And you say, I know depreciation, I don't know amortization. Amortization is for things like forests and oil wells and mines where you are using up a proportion of the things that you're getting out of that. And so if you pay $100 million for an oil well and you expect it to last 10 years, then every year you would write off $10 million worth of that oil well. That's amortization. So very similar idea. Once again, a non-cash expense. Okay. Now, why are we looking at EBITDA divided by sales? It's because this is more of an operating profit margin. It's more of an operating profit margin. Keep in mind the profit margin above has depreciation subtracted out of it. It also has interest subtracted out of it. And those things really don't have anything to do with how efficiently we're running the business. And so you could have two identical companies, one that was brand new and had a lot of depreciation. Their net income would be lower as a result. And then an old company whose machines were all depreciated out, their net income would be higher. The profit margin would be higher at the old company, even if they were doing precisely the same thing. And so that's why we look at EBITDA margin, is so we can look at the operations of the firm without worrying about the age of the assets or how they financed the money to buy those assets. Then we have return, oh, by the way, profit margin, higher or lower better? Higher. Oh, by the way, sometimes students say, hey, I've got an idea to increase profit margin. They say, why don't we just increase the price? What's the problem with that? Hey, your customers go somewhere else. If it's a commodity good like gasoline and you increase the price, you just won't sell any, right? The only exceptions that I see to this are like Tiffany. They had sterling silver jewelry. So what they did is initially Tiffany was really fancy, right? And then, but they realized they needed some way to give people an onboarding to the brand. And so they came up with the sterling silver jewelry, those little heart locket things or whatever. Okay, sterling silver. And those things sold like hotcakes. And they realized that they were diminishing their brand. And so their solution was, because they wanted to sell fewer of these things, what did they do? They raised the price. Had no impact on the sales. I would love to be in that position, right? Where you could just raise the price and people just keep buying it. I guess Tesla's probably getting there, but eventually it will catch up with Tesla. Eventually it caught up with Tiffany. But the point is, these are rare. These are very rare. Most of the time when you lift the price, you're going to lower your sales. And so that's how you end up hurting yourself. Okay. Let's see. So it's the same groups of people who are concerned about these things that were concerned about the last group of things that we talked about. And definitely, these are things that you want to keep your eye on. Oh, by the way, I need to talk about return on assets and return on equity. Return on assets is net income divided by total assets. How efficiently are we using our assets to produce a profit? That's how efficiently are we using how efficiently are we using our assets to produce a profit? We would rather it, of course, be larger. And then there's return on equity, which is net income over total equity, and that is how efficiently are we using the shareholders' investment to produce a profit. By the way, in any firm that has any debt whatsoever, you're going to see that ROE will be higher than ROA. And here's why. ROE is equal to ROA times the equity multiplier. And the equity multiplier, so this is net income over total assets. Equity multiplier is total assets over total equity. And we said that that is just 1 plus total debt over total equity. And so the more debt you have in the capital structure, the higher the ROE is for the same ROA. Leverage. That's leverage, right? That's leverage. Now let's talk about some market value measures. First, we'll talk about earnings per share. Anytime you hear accountants talk about earnings, they're talking about net income. And then all we have to do is divide by the shares outstanding. By the way, where am I going to find net income? Which financial statement? The income statement. I mean, that was a pretty softball question, right? Now, this one's a little harder. Where am I going to find shares outstanding? It's actually not necessarily on a financial statement, but it will definitely be in the firm's annual report. You could look on Yahoo Finance. You could look it up on Google Finance. Perhaps Wall Street Journal would have that information. All sorts of places you can go look for that. Okay, now, here's the fun thing. EPS in isolation is meaningless other than being positive or negative. If it's negative, we know we're losing money, right? But if I say, okay, this firm has earnings per share of $1 and this firm has earnings per share of $10, does that actually tell us anything about these firms other than that they're both profitable? No. This firm could have 10 times as many shares, 10 times 1, versus over here, $10 per share times 1. So they're both making the same amount of money, but the shares are just smaller in one firm than another. So think about a pizza. So you divide the pizza up and it's 8 pieces. If you divide it into 16 pieces, do you have any more pizza? No, the size of each piece is smaller, but you don't have any more pizza. I think it's so funny when I go into a pizza restaurant and they've got the pans up there, small, medium, large, extra large. And the people are trying to decide, and they've always got a crying kid and some crap. And the question inevitably comes up, well, how many pieces is that? And I'm like, how many do you want? Right, we can cut that sucker into as many pieces as you want. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's why we can't just look at earnings per share, one company versus another, and make any judgments about it. So what use is this thing? If you look at the same company over time, if the shares outstanding stay the same but EPS goes up, that's great, right? The big thing that happens here is that these equity analysts make predictions about what they expect the earnings to be. And if our EPS that we report ends up being higher than that, our stock price goes up. And if our stock price ends up being lower than that, our stock price goes down. And so this is one of the big numbers that investors look for to be reported out of the firm, usually reported once per quarter, earnings per share. Now let's look at price to earnings ratio, or PE ratio. And this is just the price per share divided by EPS. We've already discussed how to get EPS. Where am I going to find the price per share? What's another name for that? Where would I locate this number, this mysterious price per share? Okay. Do you still have the Robinhood app on your phone?
Yeah.
Yes. Do they have a stock price on the app?
Yeah.
Where are you going to find price per share?
That number?
Yeah, it's the stock price. That's all it is, right? By the way, don't use Robinhood. They'll rob you blind. That's why it's called Robinhood, because they're robbing you. Okay. Now, if I put this on YouTube, I'm sure I'll get nasty comments over that. So, back to the story. What were we talking about?
Stock price.
Stock price, very good. Price per share divided by EPS. Basically, it's how much are people willing to pay for $1 of current earnings. So if your PE ratio is 7, people are willing to pay $7 for $1 of current earnings. If your PE ratio is 22, people are willing to pay 22 for $1 of current earnings. And then so the question arises, why would some companies having $1 of current earning be worth more than others? And the answer has to do with growth. Firms that grow faster have higher PE ratios. Firms that grow slower have lower PE ratios. And I'll prove this to you mathematically later on in this class. But that's the big crux of it is higher growth firms have higher PE ratios. Now, whenever I'm getting a brand new group of China EMBA students, I'm so excited because they're always excited about stock and investing and they want to ask questions. And so in this talk, one of them will always say, is it good to buy high PE stocks? And I say, yes. Then someone else says, is it good to buy low PE stocks? And I say, yes. Now they're really confused. I would have scratched my chin there except that it's gotten away. I said, wait, someone said, well, what about middle PE stocks? And I say, yes. Now they're really confused. I'm like, folks, all of these things are correctly priced if we have an efficient market, which we think for the most part we do. And so basically, you need to have a well-diversified portfolio. You need to be buying all sorts of different stocks. And so the answer to all three of your questions is yes. Now let's take it down to a single industry. If I've got a single industry, let's say I've got Walmart and Target has a greater PE, that probably means that Target is executing better. They're growing more, right? So you can compare within an industry, perhaps, but just comparing, say, electric utilities versus Tesla, good luck. Not a good idea. Then we have market to book ratio. And there is the market value, it's basically the market value per share, which is exactly the same as price per share, which is exactly the same as the stock price, right? Divided by the book value per share. Now let's talk about how to get book value per share. If you go to the balance sheet and you get the book value of the common equity, it's the book value of the common equity, which by the way, on the balance sheet, when they're listing equity, they got the preferred, and everything below that belongs to the common shareholder. So basically you can take owner's equity and subtract out the preferred, and that gives you your common equity. You're going to divide that by the number of shares outstanding, and that gives you the book value per share. Now at a healthy company, the market to book will be higher than 1. At a healthy company, the market to book will be higher than 1. And the faster something is growing, or the better they are executing, the higher the market to book will be. So what you'd like to do, if you're, let's say you're a turnaround artist, you want to get in there with a company that's got a low market to book, and then you want to make some changes to get this to go up. Now, Warren Buffett, who I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but he does have a good saying here. He says, if you buy stocks with market to book less than 1, it's like giving the managers $1 and asking them to give you something less in return. If you think that's a good deal, what I want you to do is bring all your dollars to my office, and I will make your dreams come true, right? I'll just give you give me $800, I'll give you $600 in return. We both go away happy, right? Is that a good move? No. Now, let's ask this question. Do you think Warren Buffett might buy a stock with market to book less than 1? Yes. Why?
Because he thinks he can change it with his own leadership.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. Because Warren Buffett has enough money to not only buy stock in the company, he has enough money to buy the whole company, right? Do you think Warren has friends that know how to run businesses? Yeah. Do you think Warren would waste a second firing the CEO? No. He'd fire the CEO, put in his friend would bring in her friends, and then now we can take a firm with a low market to book and make it into a high market to book. But do any of you, I'm guessing none of you have that kind of money, or you wouldn't be at Missouri State, right? No, we're a value play. We're not the luxury good. Does that make sense? Okay. Market capitalization is simply the price per share times the shares outstanding, also known as the market value of the equity. The market value of the equity. And so when you ever hear on business TV, they talk about, oh, this firm's market cap is this much. What they're talking about is the market value of the equity. That's not the entire value of the firm, because we know total assets equal total debt plus total equity. It's just talking about the equity portion and the market value, not the book value. Why are we talking about market cap? Because that brings us to this next thing, which is enterprise value. If we just look at market capitalization, Apple is much bigger than many other companies. In fact, let's roll back a few years, and you can compare Apple and Exxon back then, and Apple would have a much higher market capitalization, but it had zero debt. And so the total value of the firm was actually less than Exxon, because Exxon used debt, in spite of the fact that Apple had a higher market cap. So how can we compare them apples to apples to look at the value of their operations or their enterprise? Well, we're going to take that market cap, we're going to add the market value of the interest-bearing debt. By the way, that accounts payable, is that interest-bearing debt? No, right? And so we're looking at things like notes in the short term and bonds in the long term and bank loans and things like that. That's all interest-bearing debt. And then we're going to subtract out the cash. And this is another big difference between Apple and Exxon. Apple's sitting on a huge stash of cash. Exxon was being ran far more efficiently from a cash perspective. And so by the time we add on Exxon's debt and subtract out Apple's cash, they end up being much closer. In fact, Exxon ended up being bigger than Apple. So you got to be careful when you look at these things. You say, well, this firm has double the market cap, it must be double the size. No. What if the other firm has a debt to equity ratio of 1? Then it turns out that they're actually the same size. Questions? By the way, we're looking at the value of the enterprise. That's why we're subtracting the cash. The cash, certainly, it's an asset, but it's not actually the value of the enterprise itself. It's you got the value of the enterprise, and then you got the value of the cash added onto that. So what does that bring us to? Well, we can come up with something called the EV multiple, which is the enterprise value divided by EBITDA or EBITDA, depending where you're from. I'm sure there's someone that'll say, no, it's EBITDA, whatever. And it is really kind of an operational PE ratio. You could think of it as kind of being an operating PE ratio. And the same things that would make a PE ratio higher will make this EV multiple higher. The big one is growth. The higher the growth, the greater this EV multiple will be. Any questions? Okay. First of all, only compare ratios between companies in the same industry. We've already talked about how inventory turns are different. You'll see that different industries have different total debt ratios based on the stability of their cash flows. Pretty much all of these ratios will be different based on industry. Also, you can't even compare within the same industry with different strategies. For example, Home Depot and Ace, the helpful hardware place. Home Depot is all about high turns, right? They're in the same industry. What's Ace doing? Ace is specializing in, they've got that, whatever you need, they've got it right there. Example, I went to look for a toilet flapper for my Toto toilet. And I asked the guy at Home Depot, who kind of smelled like weed, I asked him about, would this universal flapper work on my Toto toilet? And he says, yeah, man, it's universal. I was a little skeptical. So I went to Ace, and I said, I think I need a new toilet flapper. And he says, well, what's going on? And I said, my toilet's making this noise. He says, is it a Toto? I said, yeah. He said, yeah, it's the flapper. And I said, would the universal flapper work on that? He says, no, Totos are weird. They require the special flapper, but I happen to have it. Now, a couple of differences there. How much do you think the guy at Ace gets paid versus the guy at Home Depot? He gets paid more, right? What do you think the prices look like at Ace versus the prices at Home Depot? Got to be higher to pay that guy that knows what he's doing. And then finally, what do you think inventory turns look like? Inventory turns are going to be higher at Home Depot, but it's not. It's the business model that makes them different. It's the strategy that makes them different. It's not that Ace is underperforming. And then finally, we can't always apply a bigger or smaller is better mentality to ratios. For instance, remember with liquidity ratios, we said if they're too high, it means you're sitting on too much cash. Your shareholders don't want you to do that. They want you to hold on to enough cash to safely do the operations, and the other cash should be returned to them, right?